revisit Intel Arc's driver situation. We built a gigantic spreadsheet to track 641 issues across Intel's Arc GPU driver software and driver package for the past 10 months. We also compiled a driver release timeline to see how committed Intel is to new game releases and their speed of driver launches for those games. Then we checked the game ready launch driver lag, and we also clicked nearly every single button in Intel's graphics software to see what features were broken. And out of all that, we only had one catastrophic crash that seemed to break the drivers. And to be fair to Intel, that's actually a massive improvement from the last time we checked in. So this is now our third time checking in on Intel's GPU driver package. That is because the biggest hurdle between this GPU and making sure that people have a decent experience using it is the drivers and the software. And the first time we checked in with Alchemist 3 years ago now, they were a complete mess. It was basically an enthusiast-only item. But it started to kind of make sense as we checked in again later, where they started to fix a lot of the issues. They even mentioned us in one of their blog posts fixing it, and thanks Intel for mentioning us.
Thanks, Steve.
But even after that, they still had a lot to solve. Makes sense. Intel Arc is pretty new to this, and it's going to be a big uphill battle to get anywhere near where AMD and NVIDIA have established themselves with drivers. So we're checking in on the drivers again. The A380 launched in July of 2022. They launched the Battlemage B series, B580 and B570 about 11 months ago now, 10, 11 months or so. And it's been a real roller coaster of ups and downs in the time since then. So in this video, we are fully focused on Intel's driver updates, its patch cadence, its game readiness, and the bugginess of the software, or hopefully the non-bugginess of the software. And instead of focusing on performance this time, we're going to focus on the usability of just the product in general to see if we can maybe start recommending it outside of the enthusiast spaces. It's been trending that direction. They've still got some ground to make up. Let's get into it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new Duronaut thermal paste. Thermal Grizzly claims its Duronaut paste is intended for long-term stability and endurance, focusing on paste longevity in addition to the usual performance focus. Thermal Grizzly's Duronaut paste comes with applicators and spreaders, and ships in numerous tube sizes, aiming to provide a high-end paste for PC builds and daily driven overclocks by enthusiasts. Learn more at the link in the description below. All right, so we have two sections to this today. The first section, we're going to talk about some of Intel's existing or prior bug fixes, bugginess in general, issues with the software, issues with the driver, and shortcomings, and some of the positives to see where Intel has improved or has maintained if it had positives in those places. And then we'll move on to the driver update cadence and some of the game readiness that we've put together in all of our spreadsheets of Intel's updates over the last 10 months or so. So let's start with going over some of the past problems to see if they've fixed those. Back when Arc first launched, we experienced a lot of driver crashes and occasional driver corruption. It's improved, but it's not fully resolved. This time, we only had one really bad situation where Intel graphics software locked up and eventually crashed when we used the embedded link to the Windows Display Settings menu from the IGS Display tab in Intel software. After restarting Intel graphics software to fix this, the performance metrics were humorously broken, showing extremely high numbers of raw type, which you can't even pick under normal circumstances. So we rebooted again to fix that. So we've now rebooted twice, recursively, to fix problems of problems. After rebooting that time, we didn't get any video out to the monitor beyond the Windows 11 loading spinning graphic. This is when the graphics drivers are loaded, so it seemed the crash cooked the driver to the point of being non-functional. Reinstalling it fixed this, but we couldn't replicate the problem a second time. It seemed to be somewhat random. Happening once is still a problem though. Intel has to fix these high severity issues of crashing or driver corruption long-term to win over users outside of the enthusiast base. Now, it's easy to say it only happened once, which is true, and a lot of our audience can deal with that. But this is the distinction between Intel and more established companies in graphics. Not that NVIDIA's drivers have been particularly good this year either. SmoothSync is up next, which is different from other forms of frame synchronization in that it doesn't prevent tearing, but instead adds a dithering effect on the border between torn frames on screen. It originally had issues with visual corruption in several games, one of which was Rainbow Six Siege. We showed this in our original driver check-in, leading to Intel's blog post where they talked about disabling it in problematic titles. That was their fix. Now, it's certainly hard to have a feature problem if the feature doesn't exist anymore, but I guess on a technicality it was resolved, sort of. We decided to test SmoothSync again, this time in Siege X. To Intel's credit, SmoothSync works correctly in this title. The dithering also seems cleaner now than when we last looked at it. We aren't convinced that it actually makes it nicer to look at or is worth using in this title, but what matters is that it isn't just straight up broken. So the issue does seem to be resolved now, finally. Let's see if Intel can get 2 for 3 here. Now for VSync, which allows the game engine to run uncapped, but only the most recently completed frames are sent to the monitor when the monitor is ready. The theory was that this allows the latency benefits that come from uncapped frame rates just without creating tears. NVIDIA's VSync is similar in concept. 2 years ago, during our revisit, we found VSync to be gone, but it's back now. This was another one that we had complained about in our original Alchemist look at the drivers. So trying to use VSync with Siege, we found that the game would consistently crash on launch. This isn't mentioned as a known issue that we could find on the ARC patch notes pages, but there are sporadic reports of similar issues around the internet. Intel still has problems with VSync here. Intel software is up now. Intel used to have both ARC Control in the driver suite and Graphics Command Center in the Microsoft Store as a free application. These were separate applications, but they sometimes overlapped in features, and generally it was a completely awful experience because you had to go to the Microsoft Store to get some of the features. In the time since, Intel cut down to just Intel graphics software, which Intel migrated to at the end of last year in line with the B-Series launch. This was a good consolidation to get away from the confusing mix of applications before, so we're happy with their move here to combine them. One of the annoyances we previously ran into in the software was that there were multiple locations to control variable refresh rate, and there still are. The display tab of Intel graphics software has a toggle for variable refresh rate. The bottom of the display tab has variable refresh rate mode, and then separately, Windows has its own dynamic refresh rate under the advanced display menu, which isn't supported in this instance, even though the same page says that the variable refresh rate is supported. Each of these technically serves a different purpose. The graphics software setting is only available when a GPU is connected to a VRR-capable display. The variable refresh rate mode setting is always available and controls whether VRR is forced on windowed applications in addition to the usual full-screen ones. We think this option is buried a little bit and should be moved up to be alongside the first option. That would make sense to put them together. As for dynamic refresh rate, that's distinct from variable refresh rate and exists to switch the refresh rate of the monitor globally. This requires VRR up to at least 120 Hz. Intel originally required users to install its driver support assistant when installing the ARC Control software, despite having a checkbox that implied the ability to remove it. It was a forced install with the software. Around the time we reviewed the B580, we mentioned that Intel had finally moved to fix this. DSA sits there to notify the user of new driver updates and runs the risk of downloading them automatically. We also found that DSA would install multiple instances with each successive driver update or removal and install. So for example, back then you could end up with like dozens of DSA icons in the system tray. This was a problem, it was an annoyance on test benches, we had to remove it manually each time. Thankfully, this is no longer forcefully installed, and it was fixed a little while ago. We already talked about that, but recapping it here in case you missed it. You're able to freely choose any of the components and the software that sits on top of the base driver now, and the checkboxes actually work without codependencies on each other, which is what happened before. You still have to manually opt out of Intel's data collection program, but at least you actually can now while still getting the software. Alright, so that's a good fix. HDCP is next. We previously had problems with being able to use a capture card while HDCP was on. We had to use a janky splitter in order to make it happen. This time, we didn't have that issue. We didn't try a bunch of different combinations, but when we hooked up an Elgato 4K X capture card, HDCP support showed as off in Intel graphics software. As a result, we were able to capture without any friction. We'd like to still be able to manually toggle and control HDCP though, so that's good too. Notification overloads next. At launch, ARC Control would blast the desktop with toast notifications, and it wasn't possible to clear them manually. Back then, we just had to wait for them to disappear. During our last revisit, the number of pop-up notifications was reduced. Now with IGS, they're almost totally gone. We caught only 1 to 2 pop-ups during all of the testing, down from the dozens in our first round and a handful in our second round when we did the last revisit on drivers, so they've really cut it down to just 1 or 2 now. That's a good move too. On to cut features. Over time, Intel has dropped a couple features from its graphics software. We had specific criticism when we originally reviewed the ARC driver suite when it first launched about how Intel was trying to do way too much all at once, attempting to duplicate every single feature its competitors had as if it was knocking out a marketing checklist just for sake of putting it on a box. Now they're cutting features, so they're narrowing the scope, which is good. Intel no longer bundles recording and streaming functionality into the software, and that's fine with us. There's no need for Intel to compete with OBS at this point when it has to deal with maintaining all this software and making sure it's not just all fucked and broken, which has been the case in the past, so narrowing the scope here is good. The previous overlays of any kind have been removed. No FPS counter, no temperature monitor, nothing. That responsibility now sits entirely on PresentMon, which is its own utility. IGS has a tab for metrics, but it's rough. More on that in a minute. We previously included overclocking among the things that came off as unnecessary fluff at the time that ARC originally launched, especially because basics like the voltage setting were configured to the incorrect decimal point for the unit of measurement. Performance tuning is still in, and they fixed most of the basics, so it also makes more sense to us now versus during Intel's first wave efforts with the A series, when all Intel really needed to get right was stability and game support. So it makes sense to start working on this more now. Overall, we think Intel's graphics software has improved substantially from the simplification and the consolidation of the software. As for the current state of the software, it's broken down into multiple tabs: Home, Profiles, Graphics, Display, Performance, Video, Notifications, and Settings. We went through each of these tabs and all of their sub-options, adjusting values, flipping toggles, moving sliders. Generally, the attempt was to just poke and see if we could get anything to fall out in a general shake test. In general, most things appeared to work correctly. For example, the video adjustments panel is so extensive that if you really want to, you can do this. Deep-fried cyberpunk. Nice. We can appreciate it when it's actually a feature, like this is, and not a bug. Alright, this next one's a weird one. Intel graphics software has performance metrics monitoring built in, but it's unreliable, often incorrect, and it has very limited controls. First off, it's pretty clear that it uses an internal version of PresentMon for things like frame times and latency, but we couldn't find a way to point it at a target application. This should mean that it targets the app with the highest GPU load, like a game. However, it failed to do so in our testing. Sometimes it showed nothing at all, and sometimes it clearly hooked some unrelated process, showing frame times that align with something running well below 60 FPS. There are options to control the sampling window size, the averaging period, and the sampling period, or the time between polling, but changing them affects the numbers being shown in oddly proportionate ways that didn't make a lot of mathematical sense for what we were looking at. For example, stock values of 1,000 millisecond window size and 100 millisecond sampling period resulted in GPU time reading about 100 milliseconds average. Dropping the values as low as possible resulted in GPU time of about 50 milliseconds average. Setting them all the way up to 5,000 millisecond window size and 250 millisecond sampling period resulted in about 250 milliseconds for average GPU time. If you picked up on the pattern, you see that it ends up reading awfully close to whatever the sampling period itself is set to. There was even more. Setting the window size to a shorter time span than the sampling period basically prevents it from working. We tried it out on one of our test systems and ran PresentMon at the same time to compare the readouts. Sometimes IGS failed to show anything. The rest of the time, it would be sporadic and clearly wrong. Like here, where it shows about 9 FPS average when F124 was actually running at 170 or so FPS. And just a separate note here, the frame rate looks low here, but that's actually because we were testing video capture at the same time we found this issue, and the B580 was overloaded and dropping frames. We'll come back to that. Anyway, the currently useless state of IGS's monitoring tab needs to be addressed. Intel should either get rid of it or make it work. The good news is that this isn't critical to actually using the GPU day to day. We said we'd come back to it, so speaking of video capture, we briefly tested this with OBS on the B580. It's capable of doing 4K at either of OBS's non-lossless simple presets, but only if the GPU has headroom. If it doesn't, the encoder instantly gets overwhelmed and performance falls off a cliff, similar to what you'd see in CPU encoding, if the CPU is preoccupied with rendering or something. That's what was going on in the last piece of footage from F124, unrelated to the bug we were talking about in that section. The card is overloaded, so there's some forgiveness here, but NVIDIA does have an advantage in this situation. Its NVEnc solution, or NVEncoder, has a more graceful way of handling concurrent capture with heavily loaded scenarios. Intel doesn't seem to live up to that just yet. Intel's inconsistency comes back into play with Smart VSync, which is intended to only turn on when the game's frame rate exceeds the monitor's refresh rate if it's enabled. It worked reliably when changing the setting prior to launching the game, but only worked one single time when we changed it while the game was running. After that, it no longer functioned in this order or this way, contributing to the overall confusion caused by Intel's inconsistent driver behavior, because it's actually not clear when you're supposed to be able to do it because it allows it and then it doesn't anymore ever again, apparently. We're moving on to smaller complaints now. While we were in the graphics tab, we found a small UI bug under the shared GPU memory override setting. This is the type of thing that just makes us wonder if they're actually clicking on all the stuff in their own software, because that's literally all we did here. The default setting on the machine we got this capture from was a memory limit of 57% or 36.1 gigabytes. When we moved to the slider, turned off the override, then back on, the slider was still where we had set it, but the value on the left had reset to read 36.1 gigabytes again. One of these is clearly wrong, so this is a bug. Less a bug and more just annoying was the fact that after manually entering a value, the only way to lock it in was to click on the slider. Pressing enter, escape, or clicking away didn't work or didn't automatically apply, so this is just a usability shortcoming. Also annoying was the UI for rearranging the order of the metrics on the performance tab. You're supposed to click and drag the item in the list, but it has extremely aggressive edge scrolling, making it difficult to place them where you want. To wrap up our UI complaints here, the VRAM tuning tooltip doesn't agree with the slider itself. The tooltip and the slider represent memory frequency with both gigatransfers per second and gigabits per second, which we just think can be confusing for some users. The next one isn't a bug at all, but it is a limitation. Even though Intel graphics software has the ability to limit frame rates, it's strangely limited to just DX9 and DX11 APIs, no DX10, DX12, or Vulkan. We'd assume there's some technical reason for the limitation with Intel, but from a consumer standpoint, it's a shortcoming that's unexplained. It's also very easy to set global or per game frame rate caps with NVIDIA and AMD, and they don't seem to care about what API is under the hood. Up next is something we haven't looked at before, which is Intel's lag time to get drivers ready for a new game launch. Optimized drivers coinciding with new game launches are critical to the usability of any GPU for gaming. NVIDIA gets a lot of credit here. NVIDIA has made a concerted effort to market its game-ready drivers, as they call them, which is one of its more meaningful campaigns and something we can get behind. NVIDIA's strength is in this specific category, which is having a driver ready for the day a game releases. They've fumbled a bit this year with their drivers in general, but this has remained an area they're focused. This requires direct cooperation with the developers to get early access and sometimes provide engineering resources for things like shader optimization, something we actually talked with Tom Peterson, now at Intel, about in the last year or so. He showed the process. So this is one of the more important areas where Intel needs to deliver. This table shows that in the time since the B series B580 launch to when we stopped gathering data for it, Intel has included game-ready support for 39 total games, 34 of which were mentioned as supported on or before the game's release date. It's not bad. 87% of the total named games were supported in time for a player to buy it on launch day and have explicit tuning from Intel. Of the 5 that got mentioned post-launch in patch notes, the average is just 2.4 days of lag time. This is a significant improvement from Alchemist. That's a good ratio of day zero games, and it's pretty reasonable timelines for the few that aren't day zero. Ironically, the one with the longest wait was Silksong. We aren't aware of what Intel's selection or submission process is for what games get an explicit mention like this, or what level of validation has to take place to be mentioned explicitly, but based on the data, it seems like Intel is staying on top of new releases. They don't get all of them. Starfield at launch was functionally broken on Intel. But to be fair, Starfield at launch was functionally broken. We'll move on to a timeline of driver launches since Battlemage to get an idea for how committed Intel is to ARC. This is important for establishing their driver cadence for releases. We gathered archival driver release data from Tech PowerUp and from Intel officially, starting at the launch of the B series, version 6325, December 13th, 2024, until roughly mid-September, which is version 7029, just before Intel made the main driver package ARC only and kicked out the 14th gen IGPs and older. It's possible we missed a few smaller or less documented hotfixes in this. So with that caveat, over the last 10 months, from what we've found, Intel has released 13 validated WHQL drivers, which I'm going to call WHQL, and 16 beta drivers. Intel has some areas it pushed, like late May through June, with 3 beta releases and 1 WHQL release. On May 26th, Intel's 6795 beta introduced new game support and performance improvements for Elden Ring Night Rain, which would launch 5 days later. Dune Awakening was also supported to prepare for its June 10th launch, and Monster Hunter Wilds was added, which came out in February. Now that's for performance improvements. For at least this driver, Intel illustrated that it's trying to have drivers ready in time to ensure compatibility with new games or improve their performance. The 6874 WICL release from June 2nd had farming simulator flickering texture fixes, so these issues still exist for Intel. It also had important power management updates for Lunar Lake Core 200V series CPUs. Just 2 days later, Intel pushed the 6876 beta. It had game support for FBC Firebreak, Rematch, Stellar Blade, and Rainbow Six Siege X. It also featured what's possibly the most vague fix we've ever seen. For the ARC B series GPUs, Intel said it fixed, quote, intermittent visual artifacts that may appear in certain usage scenarios, end quote. Ah, yes, the old, we fixed the problem that might happen sometimes in a subset of nondescript circumstances. Thanks, Intel.
Thanks, Steve.
2 days after that, Intel pushed the 6877 beta driver to address one specific issue tied to audio on Core Ultra Series 2 equipped handhelds. 6 days later, on the 12th, they pushed a full release that only noted a fix for crashes in Overwatch 2. The rapid changes followed by a major driver version shows Intel's at least keeping busy chasing down individual bugs and fixing them as fast as possible for new games. That's a good sign of responsiveness. We think this is a great philosophy in terms of support that caters to the relatively small group of enthusiasts who've taken the plunge on ARC. It also shows that Intel is alive, so it's kind of a canary in the coal mine if this stops. We'll quickly run through some light comparisons to NVIDIA and AMD. We didn't go as in depth with these. In that same time frame for Intel, NVIDIA sits in contrast with 21 total drivers, 18 standard, 1 beta, and 2 hotfixes that are still public. The vast majority of the releases are standard WICL, which makes sense to us considering NVIDIA's dominant legacy position. Its drivers are mature and rarely require quick fixes, except the beginning of this year when they had to hotfix the hotfixes. AMD's Radeon driver team was quiet in comparison to both NVIDIA and Intel, having released only 11 drivers, 5 standard, and 6 beta. Now, to be clear, of course, the quantity of drivers isn't an indication of the quality of the drivers, but considering the frequency of the game releases, the quantity does matter. XeSS support is next. For better or worse, the industry's favorite buzzword comes into play.
AI. Let's talk about AI. AI.
Excellent. Everyone's stock value just went up. Maybe we can fabricate some more money to send between the 3 companies here. Upscaling is actually an important feature at this point. AMD and NVIDIA have FSR and DLSS. Intel has XeSS, and we checked on their progress with that option. This chart shows how many games support each of these given forms of upscaling. Support for Intel's XeSS isn't as extensive as its competitors, totaling 334 titles. This data is pre-XeSS 3 announcement, as that's not fully rolled out yet. AMD nearly doubles Intel's XeSS count at 624 games, supporting some form of FSR. FSR 1 is significantly lower quality than the versions that succeeded it, due in major part to being strictly spatial and not temporal, but we're counting it here. NVIDIA holds a numerical victory against even AMD, with 649 titles supporting DLSS Super Resolution. NVIDIA's introduction of DLSS overrides means that most DLSS titles should be able to be forced to run the latest models as well. Of course, the game matters more than just the number of games, and the version of DLSS or FSR also matters, but NVIDIA gets credit for having both bases covered in the game and the number. XeSS 2 is an especially bad situation, with only 44 games officially supported on the list at the time of writing for a solution which launched alongside Battlemage in December. It's starting to look kind of abandoned. XeSS 2 is actually an expansion of the feature set to include frame generation and XeLL, or low latency, and it's not a replacement for the actual upscaling pure base in XeSS. The additional 290 games we have listed under XeSS 1 count just as much when considering upscaling alone. Also notable is that Intel recently opened up the possibility for NVIDIA and AMD GPUs to officially support XeSS Super Resolution and frame generation, aka, get ready, XeSS sRFG, which is nearly a whole alphabet. Intel did this by publishing its XeSS 2.1 SDK. We've added more letters now, and the only requirement is support for shader model 6.4. As far as we can tell, this applies to NVIDIA's 3000 series onward and AMD's 6000 series onward. In the time since, Intel has announced XeSS 3, which we detailed in our Xe3 architecture video. That talks more about their version of MFG. Is that enough initialisms for you? Of course, based strictly on numbers, if we want to play those games, lossless scaling's LS1 wipes the floor with all of them, supporting a near infinite number of games, if that's the metric we're judging by. It's not the best metric to judge by, but it gives us something. That's the benefit, though, of not needing game or engine integration, though it does mean that image quality suffers, and sometimes significantly. Although if we want to be pedantic on a technicality, FSR1 can also have an infinite bar because lossless scaling can run FSR1, which is sort of like we heard you like upscaling, so we put upscaling in your upscaling so that you can upscale while you upscale. And we have a whole deep dive on that. If you want to check it out and you haven't seen it, you should definitely take a look. We'll link it below. And now for a table of fixed and known issues. This table is deceptively small, considering that it required crawling through and collating 641 mentions of known issues and 81 mentions of fixed issues, which Jeremy on the team did by crawling through 9 months worth of Intel's patch notes, and then he put together the aggregate table you're looking at. Intel declares 81 total issues fixed since the B series launch, 12 for A series, 34 for B series, 4 for Core Ultra 1 integrated GPUs, 25 for Ultra 2 integrated GPUs, and 6 for software or general fixes. Of those, only 44 were mentioned previously as known issues. Of those, the average time to fix was 39.9 days. We assume that the rest of the previously unmentioned fixes were things that got noticed and addressed quickly, such as between releases. We also noticed 2 issues that were mentioned as fixed twice for the same exact issue and the same product category. The first was first mentioned as a known issue on April 3rd, 2025 for the ARC B series GPUs that says, quote, Returnal may experience an application crash during gameplay with ray tracing settings turned on, end quote. This was marked as a fixed issue on June 30th, but was then fixed a second time on July 23rd. Quote, Returnal DX12 may experience an intermittent application crash during gameplay with ray tracing settings turned on, end quote. The one difference is the word intermittent, which leads us to think that edge cases causing Returnal to crash continued to surface. The second issue was on August 7th for the ARC A series GPUs. It said Mafia, the old country, quote, may exhibit corruptions on character hair during gameplay, end quote. Obviously, this is unacceptable because it's happening on character hair. It got marked fixed on August 11th, resurfaced, and then got fixed again on September 10th. And that second update narrowed the scope down to what they call, quote, certain scenes, end quote, which sounds like the same kind of situation. Intel thought it fixed the problem, but somehow, quote, corruptions on character hair, end quote, returned. Overall, though, the important thing is the average time to fix an issue that's listed as known. That's just under 40 days. All right, so to wrap this up, we think that the usability and general kind of mandatory annoyance of using an Intel Arc GPU when you buy it is in a significantly better place than it was a few years ago, and also in an at least partially better place than where it was 2 years ago when we did that revisit, and it's a little bit better than what we saw last year too. So they are gradually improving. It is night and day difference though in the current iteration of Battlemage, now end of 2025 basically, versus Alchemist when it first launched years ago. Like that difference, that it's basically feels like a different company at this point. I guess it kind of is. They've fired like a quarter of it. So, but you get, I think you, okay, it's just better that we focused on the GPUs right now. The fact that there's now only one piece of software, which is Intel graphics software for all the settings, is a substantial improvement, and the fact that it's less bloated as an app than what came before it is also good, especially because the features typically tend to mostly work now. So they're getting rid of stuff that Intel really has no business trying to support every single checkbox that AMD and NVIDIA offer, which is really what it felt like they were launching with. It was like they felt like they needed to have a one-to-one for every feature in a driver package that has existed for over 20 years from their competitors, and it was just spreading them way too thin. It didn't make sense. You know, they got to focus on like the thing they need is a GPU that works out of the box and can play games that people want to play, especially when they're new. And it looks like they've done a better job at refocusing and cutting a bunch of the crap and just focusing on the core of what they need to even begin to sell a GPU. You can always add stuff to it later and staple stuff on, but it's better to stay focused, and they've moved that direction. There are still things for Intel to fix, like the seemingly totally broken built-in monitoring and the unreliable frame sync settings. The one crash we had that basically broke the drivers is also a catastrophic failure, but we weren't able to replicate that in testing. So it seems to be a sporadic issue. It maybe requires a very specific set of circumstances. So that's kind of on their side. It still obviously shouldn't happen though. It can also be frustrating to have game crashes just from picking speed sync or from seeing smart VSync work once, but never again. There's also things for Intel to upgrade, like adding frame rate caps for more than just DX9 and DX11 games, and if possible, making it easier to capture video while the GPU is fully loaded. Although that may be more of a hardware level fix because NVEncoder has sort of spoiled us all. It is actually genuinely very good. Credit to NVIDIA for that. All right, so we think the more aggressive Intel can stay on fixes, the more viable it's going to be. Battlemage got into a decent spot overall from a price to performance standpoint. In a lot of cases, it actually looks really good on paper. And part of that's because NVIDIA has largely abandoned that market. They have like some presence there, but not much. They're just not that interested in it. AMD seems to just tie itself to NVIDIA minus a couple bucks and doesn't really, I guess, consider much of Intel's presence right now. So Intel does have an advantage in that cheap market, but then it's when you zoom out and look at the full picture that obviously it starts to really matter. And so our stance on it currently is the drivers have improved significantly. We've kind of drawn this distinction over time of who should buy this. And a lot of times it comes down to an enthusiast could deal with the problems, but could a normal end user? And so to make that distinction a little further this time, I think where I stand personally is if I have a friend who is a little less patient with technical issues or just has absolutely no time to deal with some kind of weird behavior and it's going to come back to me to troubleshoot it for them because I recommended the device, then for that friend, I would still not recommend ARC. I don't think it's there yet where, you know, if it's someone who just absolutely, I mean, I think we all know at least one person like this where absolutely no tolerance at all for some kind of technical issue. They can't deal with it. It's overwhelming, whatever. I still wouldn't recommend it to that kind of user because chances are at some point they're going to launch a game and there's going to be a problem and they're going to have a bad time. And if they don't have another GPU, there's not really an easy fix. For pretty much everyone in our audience, I think ARC is viable if you're in a situation still where you have a little more patience for that kind of problem. It is far better than it was with Alchemist. In Alchemist, I would say, and I did say, that it is non-viable for basically anybody except for an enthusiast with a second GPU from NVIDIA or AMD. I think we're past that point, but we are still in the sort of territory where to feel good about recommending Battlemage, like the B580, I would need to do so to a user who still has a technical skill set, but it is improving. It's kind of like it's a gradient, and it's shifting more and more slightly towards eventually mainstream sort of normal users who just can't deal with the bullshit, but it's not fully there yet. So massive improvement from Intel. I think for people in our audience, it's worth considering. But obviously, just you need to know what the limitations are. And we've gone through those today, so hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea. Performance per dollar is in a pretty good spot. It's just always come down to, well, what about the driver viability? Hopefully this helps you figure that out. The spreadsheet Jeremy put together is fucking gigantic for the 641 issues, I think it was, that he tracked across all the driver patch notes. And yeah, we had some cool data for it. So let us know what you think. Hopefully you like this type of video. Very different approach to us we're trying to combine objective numbers-based driver analysis with the actual user experience, the usability, which is the thing we were trying to evaluate today. We've done performance before, we'll do it again, but this is kind of like the core of what's the user experience, and it's very hard to quantify it, so hopefully we've done an okay job of that. But let us know. You can go to store.gamersxs.net to help us out directly by grabbing one of our PC building anti-static mod mats, one of our coaster packs. We're actually extremely low on inventory of the original coaster pack 1. So pick that up on the store if you want it and you want to support us. I don't have any reorders in the works for that one right now, so if you do want it, then you should get it before it goes out. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. See you all next time.